We have to get away from this cartoonish idea of inspiration. And doctrinal development is one of those. God says, there's an afterlife. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Come on, psalmist, cough it up, start writing. He writes down, again, what he understands of it. God says, okay, that'll do. Good enough for now. Time goes on. We're out of the Old Testament period. You got a lot of Jewish writers speculating on things. New Testament period comes along. Peter wants to write something about the underworld or the afterlife. And he happened to read 5 years ago this book by Philo over here. And God says, that was a pretty good book by Philo. I mean, I didn't really tell him to write it, but it was a good book. Why don't you remember that page? And when you remember that page, put that in. That's a good line. And Peter puts it in. Good job. That'll be clear. Because the whole idea is communication. Okay, it wasn't until the 15th century that we have, the whole issue resolved of, can you sail this way and come out the other? The whole idea about the Earth being a globe and all that kind of stuff, that was debated up into the 15th century. We look at that and go, it's just poetic. It is to us. But what I'm going to say is, again, back to my introduction, if you take it literally, you have to give them the benefit of the doubt. They were serious about it. All these concepts and even some of the terms are part of ancient Near Eastern cosmology. In other words, what I'll show you tonight, the division of the world, what the world looks like in Israelite cosmology, you can find the same descriptions anywhere else. Egypt, Mesopotamia, ancient Syria, the Hittites, whatever. Because this was a common worldview. Now, if we say that Israel knew better through special divine revelation, then we have a problem. Then we have to say that the literature of the pagans, somehow they knew too. Did God speak to them? Where'd they get that information? I really don't want pagan literature to be in any way even looking inspired. Okay, that opens a real can of worms for inspiration. It's just ground we need to stay away from, and for good reason. It's legitimate to stay away from it. If we let the Bible be what it is, though, we can claim it's unique theologically and what it says about God. But if not, then pagan literature is essentially on the same level. And trust me, you don't want to go there. You want it to be unique. Let's get into it here. Exodus 24. Israelite cosmology has 3 tiers. This is the Ten Commandments passage. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. 3 levels. New Testament is the same. Philippians 2:8, verse 10. So that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. What, like the worms? No. We're going to see what they were thinking here. Revelation 5, heaven, earth, under the earth. It's a 3-tiered cosmology. This is what it would look like. I didn't make this graphic, which is why it looks cool. Okay? Somebody gave this to me because they hated, honestly, at Western, they hated the one I used, and so they gave me this. This is a 3-tiered cosmology. Here's God. We're going to see it in the verses I'll show you that God lives above the vault of heaven, the firmament. And in the firmament you have windows and doors. And you have the earth. We're going to see verses that talk about the ends of the round, flat earth here. Underneath is Sheol. Sheol can be both the grave, and it can also be the underworld. Okay, it's not quite hell, but it's sort of like hell. We can talk a little bit about it. And then underneath that, we have the great deep. These are all scriptural terms that are on this map. This is what an Israelite, an Egyptian would have had different terms, but the same 3-tiered level. Same with the Mesopotamians. Now, they have, theologically, they have dramatically different views of what's going on here. Not just who made it, but what's going on. Views of afterlife, the value of humanity. It's dramatically different. And I've made the comment before, Genesis is about theological messaging. And there are some dramatic differences in what Israel is saying, the Bible is saying, and anything else. So let's take a look at the parts. Waters above and below the heavens. Genesis 1:6, God said, let there be an expanse. Some translations have firmament. It's rakiah in Hebrew. In the midst of the waters. And let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse, the rakiah, and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And what was that expanse called? Heaven. The heavens, the sky, Shemayim in Hebrew. So you have here sky, okay, and you have waters above the sky, and of course you've got waters below down here, but then you have, the atmospheric heavens as well. Psalm 148 mentions the waters that are above the heavens. That's after the flood. Did you catch that? Because a lot of people want to say, oh, the waters above, they went away with the flood. See, the firmament was this canopy thing, and it was there, and then the flood, it just went away. And no, it wasn't. According to the psalmist, he's still referring to it. Proverbs 8, when he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep. Isn't that interesting? We'll get to that. Circle on the face of the deep. When he made firm the skies above. Made firm is amatz in Hebrew. It is the same verb for letting a tree grow firm, hard. Ancient cosmology across the board believed that the sky was this dome over the earth, and it was solid. Kind of like the Truman Show. Okay? They believed that the stars were affixed to it. Some of the stars never moved, but other ones did. And the ones that did, this is why the word stars is attributed to the sons of God and to angels in biblical literature. They believed that the stars were animate beings, that they were really divine beings, and then they'd come to earth as angels, but they lived up there. And those were the ones that moved. Why? Because movement shows what? If something moves, it's alive. Okay? Again, they can't take a rocket and go up and check it out. They believe that this is there's a solid expanse over them. Another passage. Job 37, verse 18. Can you, like him, speaking of Job, drawing the dramatically poor comparison of God and Job, of course we know who's going to win there, but can you, like him, spread out the skies hard, kazak, hard as cast metal, mutsak, as a metal mirror. Mutsak is the same word used in the casting of the laver, the tabernacle where they would wash. It's solid. It's also the same terminology used for flint rock. Again, these passages point to the belief that there's a dome, the sky's a dome, and it's solid. And God lives above it, we live below it. Job 22, did I skip one? No, I didn't. But you say, what does God know? Can he judge through the deep darkness? Thick clouds veil him so that he does not see, and he walks on the vault of heaven. That's where God lives. It's his address. And before we think, oh, that's quaint, how cute. We think that, don't we? If a little child would ask you, where does God live? Up there. Is there something wrong with that answer? I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Use it, because there's the sense that God lives off planet. Why? Because he created the earth for us. He doesn't need it. He's independent of it. He transcends it. That's all it is. It's very normal. Amos 9:6, he builds his upper chambers in the heavens and founds his vault upon the earth, the vault upon the earth, who calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out in the surface of the earth. The Lord is his name. And Psalm 29, Lord sits enthroned over the flood. Let's go back here. We talk about the middle tier now, the earth. Here's a God's eye view of the world. If God is sitting above the firmament and looking down at it, what does he see? This is where we get Genesis 1:9. God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place." Waters, plural, one place. How can you get all the waters in one place and then still call them seas? And the dry land appeared. That's how you get it. All the waters, one place, earth, but they're still seas, again, depending on what direction you're coming from or where you're at. Because if you're over here, you're going to call this something sea, and you can't really see what's going on over here. So if you live on the other side, that's another sea. But you got all the seas together. Proverbs 8, when he established the heavens, I was there when he drew a circle on the face of the deep. Circular. He made firm the skies above, so on and so forth. Here's an interesting one. He has inscribed a circle on the face of the waters at the boundary between light and darkness. What's the boundary between light and darkness? Think about it. You all know the answer to this. What's the boundary? Think literally. What's the boundary between light and darkness? Does it get dark here? Does it get light here? Where's the boundary? The horizon. That's the boundary between light and darkness. If this is your view of the world, your horizon is right here. That's where the firmament ends and it meets. It's stopping the waters from going any further. And it goes all the way around. The whole thing. Because if you're on a circular earth, everywhere you look, there's a horizon. The place where light and dark meet. Again, I told you I'm going to be a flaming literalist tonight. I'm going to say that I'm going to take them absolutely at their word. Vault of the heavens, pillars and mountains. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astounded at his rebuke. Oh, that's just metaphor and poetry. Yeah, to us it is. If you ask them, it's like, well, there's that big mountain thing. I mean, that's holding up the sky. Duh. If you don't believe it, go find. I mean, how are you going to find out any different? Obviously we can, but the means to do that isn't with them. 2 Samuel 28, the earth reeled and rocked, the foundations of the heavens trembled and quaked because God was angry. Windows and doors. On that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. Psalm 78, yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven. Again, familiar phrases. Pillars under the earth, supporting the earth. Again, look at the language. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. You betcha. It's not Marduk. It's not that silly Ta in Egypt. It's Yahweh who did that. Isn't that amazing? I mean, an Israelite would want you to marvel. He would think you're insane if you didn't. Either that or a pagan. Job 38:4. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. To him who spread out the earth above the waters. Again, think of the circle with the earth in the middle. For his steadfast love endures forever. Sheol, the last level. Sheol is a Hebrew word. In the ESV, I think in most cases they just have Sheol. It's Sheol in Hebrew. It can mean the hole that they just dug to put you in when you're dead. Or it can mean the underworld. Okay. I said the very first week, we have this idea that hell, the underworld, is down there. Where do we get that? We get that from the Old Testament. Okay, that's just... Do you think hell has a latitude and a longitude? Does it have an address? I mean, could you put it into your GPS and it would take you there? I mean, it doesn't have latitude and longitude. These are what are called cosmic geographical terms. Heaven is where God is. It doesn't have a latitude and a longitude. But if you try to describe it, you're forced, because you live and you're limited by space and time, you're forced to use geographical language. Over there, up there, down here. You know, he passed over what? Like, would I stumble on it if I came across? I mean, you know, we use this language today, and we're forced to, because we are not inhabitants of a non-physical reality. We're trapped into using this language about a place that doesn't have locality that our bodies can identify with. That's why we need new bodies, different bodies. Because if it's this one, we ain't getting there. Right? It just, you know, we're just trapped. This is our existence. And they have the same problem in the Old Testament. Job 26:5, the dead, the word is Rephaim, tremble under the waters. The Rephaim were not so nice inhabitants of the underworld. Tremble under the waters. Sheol is under the waters. Sheol is naked before God, and Abaddon has no covering. Abaddon is another word. Again, that word comes up in Revelation for the destroyer, the pit. Okay? Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades, the Rephaim, to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. Everyone righteous or wicked goes to Sheol. Everybody dies. Psalm 89, what man can live and never see death? Who can deliver his soul from the power of Sheol? Answer, nobody. Okay. Now the righteous went to Sheol. The hope of the righteous in the Old Testament was that they get to leave at some point to be with the Lord. Jacob goes there. I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Hezekiah goes there. I'm consigned to the gates of Sheol for the rest of my years. See, when you went to Sheol, you were still alive. You were dead, but you're alive. You know, kind of like we think today, when people die, they're still alive. You know, we use the same language because that's the language of Scripture. You still exist beyond your physical death. You're still alive, but you're there, you know, some direction, okay? Hezekiah is saying the same thing. David, certainly, I think he's going to be in heaven, but he goes to Sheol. Cords of Sheol entangled me, snares of death. You know, are you going to praise, anybody going to praise you in Sheol? The cords of Sheol entangled me. The wicked also go there. They spend their days in prosperity, and in peace they go down to Sheol. Job's kind of ticked about that. They say to God, depart from us. We don't desire the knowledge of your ways. What's the Almighty, and why should we serve him? What profit do we get if we pray to him? They're obviously unbelievers, but they go to Sheol too. Everybody goes to Sheol. The hope is that you get out. Now, that is a very brief overview of Old Testament cosmology. And I'm coming back to this slide, but I think I'd kind of like to go back to, well, some of us won't have the context for it. Let's just end here. There is a passage, if any of you bring it up in Q&A, I have more slides about it, but I'm going to end here, that relates to cosmology that might have popped in your head as far as a question, dealing with the Earth's shape as well. But the message I want you to take away again is Genesis is about theological messaging. Just like with our illustration, we spent a long time leading up to the cosmology slides, the conversation between the 6-year-old and the scientist. When you accept the way that the critic frames the debate, you're not going to get very far. If you remember the conversation, the 6-year-old, God made my baby brother. And the scientist says, no, he didn't. Your mommy and daddy did. I asked you who was right. And we said, they're both right. Then I asked you who was wrong. And we said, they're both wrong. But we can parse that because we separate mentally the truth claim, the message, the assertion, the truth assertion being put out, and we immediately contextualize the person's worldview. And even if it's flawed, like the 6-year-old's was, her point is still correct. And if we look at Genesis this way, it doesn't matter that Genesis is, and the rest of the Bible is littered with this kind of cosmological language, because God didn't bother to change the culture. He could have if he wanted to. He didn't care. If he had cared, he would have done it. The only other conclusion is that he couldn't, and then you have a problem with omnipotence. Okay? God doesn't care. I'm coming to these people at this time, in this place. It's second millennium BC. They don't know it's BC yet because Jesus doesn't come. But it's a long time, okay, way, 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 way back. And I'm going to give them a message, and they're going to do the best they can under my influence to express it. I'm going to watch as they write. If they goof up, I'm going to send somebody along. Go fix that. They didn't quite get it right. Somebody will come along and clean that up a little bit. When it gets done with the process, God can look at this thing we call the Bible and say, good job. It's pretty good. I'm satisfied with that. But all of that content is fixed in a particular worldview that we don't have. Okay, we have to let it be what it is. And let God's decision to do it that way settle with us. And my challenge to you is try it. Okay, if you do that, you don't need to justify it to science. They need to justify why they're criticizing it for not being what it was never intended to be. And that would be an interesting conversation. Don't accept that the way they articulate the debate. So if you have any questions, we can jump into that. I really have no idea what time it is. Oh, not bad, because we started late. So that was about an hour. Anybody have any questions? Yes. No, you cannot play that thing again.
Also, Sheol, is that where the Hagrid's believe?
Purgatory? Yeah, the idea of temporary purgation or punishment, it is where it comes from. This sort of holding tank, holding place. Now, the difference is you're not going to see... Catholicism gets the basic idea from this, but what you're not going to see in the Old Testament is the idea that when you're in Sheol, you are being punished a certain amount, and then when you cross the line, you're out. Okay, that's Catholic doctrine, but you won't find that in the Old Testament. The idea was everybody goes to Sheol. We put you in the ground. Again, think of what we do today. We bury the dead. And we have this conception today, because of the New Testament, that if they're a believer, they're already with the Lord, and if they're not, they're in hell. The Old Testament doesn't quite articulate it that firmly. Their idea was we bury them. They're in the ground. We know because we watched them put that person there. But now somehow, if we go back here to the picture, Sheol was conceived as being connected to the ground. Eventually, that person that we put in the ground winds up going down there. And if they were righteous, the hope was, like the psalmist says, someday I will see, the Lord, or I will walk with him, or like Job, I will see my Redeemer face to face. They didn't really know when that was going to happen. But if you were righteous, if you believed in the God of Israel, that was your faith. You believed that I am not going to stay here. I am going to be with the Lord because I walk with God. I put my faith in the God of Israel. So the Old Testament lacks things like timing and real full description that you actually get in the New Testament. But the ideas, the places are the same. It's not, there are differences, but they're not dramatic. But Catholicism adds to it to get the idea of earning merit through purgation. You don't have that in the Old Testament. Yes.
How does Jesus' parable with Lazarus and rich man apply to Earth? Is that something separate from the Old Testament?
I would not use the word separate. I would use the word more detailed. What you see is when you have the Old Testament, at a given point, the Old Testament period ends. And then naturally, people within Judaism are doing what we do. They're writing about their Bible, like producing commentaries and things like that. And a lot of that literature speculates on, like, what's the place like? What goes on down there? And eventually you get fuller descriptions. You get more details. You get persons on either side. Like there's the side that, in Sheol that, Abraham can sort of look at where it is. He's safe, but he can look down, look over into this place. And in that particular instance, there's a very clear idea of fiery punishment. There's only one. You don't really get fiery punishment in the Old Testament. What you do get, though, is Sheol was a fearful place because of who was there. And there are some sinister characters there. It's described as watery. There's one passage that talks about, it mentions flame, but the question is whether it's like a burning place or not. But there are demonic, bad entities there. It's a fearful place to be. So it's definitely cast as the place that God isn't and that the bad things are, but you don't get the full descriptions of punishment. You get that on into the intertestamental period, and then the New Testament is very consistent with that. So you actually have, I'm going to use the double D word, doctrinal development, okay, for the doctrine of the afterlife. And before that scares you, all doctrines develop. Okay, I challenge you to find a doctrine, a biblical doctrine, that isn't different in some way between the testaments. They're never exactly the same. They progress. We believe in something called progressive revelation. You say, well, those books in the middle, those intertestamental books, they're not part of Revelation. No, they're not. But the writers on either side, especially the New Testament writers, they're reading these. Okay, they quote some of them in the New Testament. New Testament quotes some non-canonical sources to make a theological point because they're thinking about what they're doing. Now, in the doctrine of inspiration, we say that God was fine with that. God providentially said, you want to quote that? Fine. It helps. Yeah, you're right. It's a good illustration. You have to view what's going on in a very providential sense. I think you're getting the feel. When it comes to inspiration, I'm just going to say this. We think of inspiration often wrongly. We think of it as an event. Prophet gets up, starts making eggs for breakfast. His mind blanks out and his hand starts to move, and he's not conscious of this at all. He wakes up and goes, wow, that's pretty cool. I didn't know I could do that. That is not inspiration. Inspiration ought to be viewed more like canonicity. A long, providentially guided process that took as long as God wanted it to take. And in the end, God looked at it and said, good job, thumbs up, you got it. Okay, it's not zapping, all right? It's not automatic writing like it's a paranormal experience, okay? It's a long developing process where God is in the process. He was in the process before the writer was even born. He's preparing the environment into which that writer will be born. He's preparing the parents. He's preparing the education. He's preparing everything about that guy or that collection of guys ahead of time. He sees all that. Because at the end of the trail, God wants to look at it and say, you got it. Now from this point on, just start copying it. No changes. We're done. Just copy the thing now. And then again, that sets up, its own set of circumstances. We have to get away from this cartoonish idea of inspiration. And doctrinal development is one of those. God says, there's an afterlife. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Come on, psalmist, cough it up, start writing. He writes down, again, what he understands of it. God says, okay, that'll do. Good enough for now. Time goes on. We're out of the Old Testament period. You got a lot of Jewish writers speculating on things. New Testament period comes along. Peter wants to write something about the underworld or the afterlife. And he happened to read 5 years ago this book by Philo over here. And God says, that was a pretty good book by Philo. I mean, I didn't really tell him to write it, but it was a good book. Why don't you remember that page? And when you remember that page, put that in. That's a good line. And Peter puts it in. Good job. That'll be clear. Because the whole idea is communication. It's not producing some paranormal artifact. The idea is communication. People under God's hand doing the task, producing something to be preserved for posterity. That's all it is. It's a very, you understand when I say that, it's a very human thing. But God is in the process. I don't know why we need God to zap people. I just don't get it. I say that, and I know people living today need zaps. Because they know, honestly, they feel like they're not walking with God unless they get zapped. I'm not going to name any names. But you know what I'm talking about. Okay. God can't be real unless I'm zapped. Well, actually, he can. If you think a little bigger, he can. I went, sorry for that rabbit trail, but any other questions? That's a hobby horse of mine. I think you can tell, but yes.
Well, I guess it seems like Romans 1:20.
Oh, is that a good one?
Takes us as believers kind of off the hook, kind of like what you're talking about, and puts the it puts the burden on the unbeliever. See, because Paul's telling that Romans here that other Romans that that they're responsible for what they see. It's really that's pretty basic verse, and so to me it seems like what you're talking about here. That's right. That we don't need to be, some of these baseless arguments or whatever, And that vein of thought, what do you think about it? So a lot of these Christian creation institutes, are they a waste of time and money? Or
I don't, that's a fairly difficult question because on the one hand, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that their heart's in the right place. It's easy to understand that the enemy isn't so much Darwin. It's really how Darwin is used. Because I know plenty of Christians that could really care less about Darwin because, okay, if evolution's right, big deal. That's how God did it. What's the next topic? It's literally like that. And for them, the issue is the evil in Darwinism is the way it's used to not only divorce creation from God, but to kill God. So in view of that is so prevalent today, if somebody wants to fight Darwinism, and that's what's in their crosshairs, I'm glad you're opposed to that. I'm opposed to it too. I'm wary of it for the reasons that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. So on matters like this, I have to give people the benefit of the doubt because I can't get into their heads. If they really feel led by God to do that work and to give to that work and to be involved in that, I'm going to let them go. Just, Lord bless you. What I want from you is for you to understand why I'm not. But I'm still on the same page. I mean, I still agree with your goal, and I'm your ally. If you want to look at me as the loyal opposition, you can. I mean, I'm no fan of evolution. I frankly have a hard time even caring about it, to be honest with you, and I think you can sort of tell why. But I would let them know that I'm friend, not foe. And if they're going to shoot at me for not being more friendly and not being militant, oh wow. And trust me, I do get shot at for that. But, I would never try to judge what someone feels is the Lord's work and sit in judgment on that and say that's not the Lord's work. I would hope that they would mature in ways that would just let us be at our respective places. I don't know if that helps, but that's just where I'm at on that. Anybody else? Okay, I thought you were going to drift into somewhere else, and I'm not going to open a can of worms here because we need to go. But I'm going to yield to temptation a little bit. Go home. Read Romans 1:20, and then read Romans 10:18, and then look in the cross reference in the margin of Romans 10:18. Paul is quoting Psalm 19, verse 4, and then ask yourself, what is he thinking?